Hello and welcome to another episode of Meyer Tech. Today I want to talk about processor speed and performance and how to measure it with a particular emphasis on clock speeds and that number that you see on the box. Say you buy an i5 7500, you'll see that you have 4 cores and a clock speed of 3.4 gigahertz. This means your processor has a clock speed of 3.4 billion clocks per second. Wow, that's really impressive. That means this processor must be faster than another processor with a clock speed of only 3 gigahertz. Hold on a second, that sounds great, but it's really not that simple. Let's explore. To help explain this, we're going to go down mobile lane. We're going to talk about 2 CPUs found in smartphones, particularly one made by Apple and one made by Samsung, notably the Apple A10 and the Samsung Exynos 8890. Both of these processors have a clock speed of around 2.3 gigahertz, except that Apple's processor only has 4 cores, actually 2 big ones and 2 little ones, whereas Samsung's processor actually has 8 cores, similarly set up with 4 big ones and 4 little ones. In both cases, it's the faster cores that are going about 2.3 gigahertz, whereas the slower ones are running a much lower frequency. Given this information so far, you might expect that Samsung and Apple's single-thread performance would be similar. After all, they both have large cores that are running at about 2.3 gigahertz, and you would expect that Samsung's multi-threaded, up to 8-thread performance would be significantly faster than that of Apple's. This actually couldn't be further from the truth, whereas the Apple processor has far greater single-thread performance, and in multi-threaded performance, it actually beats Samsung's processor? How can that be? Oh, that's in the mobile realm. Lots of crazy stuff happens there. In desktops, it's all pretty much the same, except it's not. Let's look at the AMD 8350, FX 8350, and the Intel i5 7600. The AMD FX 8350 has a clock speed of about 4 gigahertz, 4.2 boost, so single thread performance it's going to get 4.2, whereas the i5 is going to get a single thread boost of 4.2. Well, you might look at that and expect that the Intel performance would be a little bit higher, but the AMD CPU is actually technically an 8-core, whereas the Intel is 4-core, so you'd think the Intel will be little bit faster in single core, but the AMD should be faster in multi-threaded performance. It's actually not. Here we're going to look at some benchmarks, and it's actually the case that the Intel CPU is much faster than the AMD CPU. Kind of similar to the Samsung and Apple scenario we had before, wasn't it? Now, the multi-threaded performance is actually pretty similar. Again, how can this be? It's because these processors are designed very differently. Even though the mobile processor is based on ARM and the desktop processors are based on x86, the implementation of these architectures are very different. On a high level, these differences can be measured in what's called IPC, or instructions per clock. In layman's terms, some CPUs actually do more work per clock cycle than others, and IPC is a measurement of how much work is being done per cycle. Now there's another trap here too. You can't just take IPC and multiply it by clock speed and get real-world performance. Well, this will give you a much better idea than just looking at clock speed. There's still a lot of differences between CPUs, as in some CPUs actually have better IPC for some tasks than others. So you have to look at average IPC across a range of tasks. As a result of this, and honestly what we're getting to, this is why in order to get a really good idea of how powerful a CPU is, you have to look at benchmarks. And not just one benchmark, you have to look at a range of benchmarks that cover the full range of tasks that you plan on giving your CPU. Whereas some CPUs might be great at some things, and that might be useful to some people, maybe another CPU is actually better at other tasks and might be better for other people. A good example of this is a lot of games require really high single-thread performance, whereas other games require really good multi-threaded performance, and the single core doesn't really matter. Some tasks require really strong integer compute, whereas others require floating point or double precision floating point calculations. And now, because I am physically incapable of getting through a video without mentioning Zen, remember when I compared the AMD FX 8350 with the i5 7500? Well, the 8350 lost because its IPC was really low, compared to Intel at least. With Ryzen, we're finally going to get that IPC boost. In fact, AMD has been claiming at least a 40% increase in IPC. Now, this is really critical. They're trying to get IPC up to the level of Intel to compete directly. In final conclusion, the only way to tell the performance of a CPU, or really any part of computer hardware, is to benchmark it.